Since the appearance of characters like Jazz the Jackrabbit and Mario, the video game industry has made leaps and bounds by releasing a number of titles each and every year. But not all video games can be successful, with some of them becoming the bane of the very industry that created them. But which games have inherited this status, and what is it about them that's so awful? For all this and more, stay tuned. Number 1. Hong Kong 97. First up on our list is a video game from the era of the Super Famicom, which is by far one of the least memorable Nintendo products of the late 90s. We are, of course, referring to Hong Kong 97, a game which was released in 1995, but continues to be incredibly difficult to find considering its unlicensed nature. Why did Nintendo refuse to hit it with the official seal though? Well, it could have something to do with the creators being sued for the use of both stolen images and foul language, which back in the 90s was a definite negative in the industry. It's not just that which made Hong Kong 97 a horrible experience. The hilarious intro song, which doesn't even last long, we might add, quickly becomes annoying, and this is impossible to avoid since the creators established a consistent loop of the song, lasting throughout the runtime of the game. Suffice to say, developer Happysoft didn't think of the frustration that this constant loop would create amongst the fanbase. Something that is made even worse by the fact that one death results in a total reset of the game. Imagine a hell where you're constantly subjected to a single track while playing the same levels over and over again with the intention of reaching the end of the game, but rather than succeeding, you find yourself falling just short. That's the experience Hong Kong 97 brings to its players, so it's no surprise that it's so hated. Number 2. Superman 64. Next up on our list is none other than Superman 64, a game that to this day is considered by many to be one of the worst official products Nintendo has ever touched. Released back in 1999 on the Nintendo 64, players were able to step into the shoes of Superman, the DC superhero that was able to do everything from flying to the reversing of time. And when you have such an impressive superhero at your fingertips, it goes without saying that the payoff better be huge. And that's where Titus Interactive went wrong. By taking on the property, the developer found itself biting off more than it could chew. Flying mechanics were nowhere where they were supposed to be at the time, and having all the power in the world but very little ways to use it meant an incredibly restrictive product that made gamers feel more frustrated than impressed. The fact that Nintendo advertised the game as the latest and greatest in action-adventure also hyped Superman 64 up to a certain extent, causing a slew of disappointments to follow its release. And if this wasn't enough, development was plagued by the strained relationship between DC Comics and Warner Brothers, who couldn't quite decide on how the profits of the property were going to be distributed. Suffice to say, this resulted in a game that to this day is considered to be broken, with gamers suggesting that you simply can't get worse than Superman 64. Number 3. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. If there's one thing gamers hate more than broken games though, it's cash grabs that have nothing to do with the properties that they are carrying through. The fact that Resident Evil is an incredible game does not mean it's going to be a successful movie franchise, for example. And the opposite is true. Keeping this in mind, it's really no wonder that E.T. the Extraterrestrial was widely hated by the industry once it was released back in 1982. In fact, the E.T. the game goes even further than this, having been created by Howard Scott Warshaw for the Atari gaming system in just 5.5 weeks. The definition of rushed, if we do say ourselves. And when it was finally released in December of that year, the game went on to receive one of the most negative critiques in the history of gaming, with many blaming it for the game's industry crash of 1983. It goes without saying, but E.T. the Extraterrestrial was an absolute commercial failure. So bad, in fact, that rumors began to circulate that millions of copies of the game had been buried in a landfill somewhere in New Mexico. Surprisingly enough, there was some truth to this, with Atari being stuck with millions of copies that couldn't be sold. But despite the lessons learned from E.T. regarding the dangers of rushing and putting zero thought into development, we still have stinkers to this day that fall into the E.T. category. Number 4. Big Rigs, over-the-road racing. It's not just action-adventure games that make it onto this list though. As it turns out, one of the worst games in the history of gaming is a racing title known as Big Rigs, over-the-road racing. And this is quite surprising since racing games don't usually need a lot of effort to be successful. Think of how much fun you had playing that graphically unsound arcade racing game growing up, and you'll see where we're coming from. from. In fact, all racing games really need to flourish is the ability to steer a digital vehicle along the road. Unfortunately for big rigs, this wasn't as easy as the developer first thought though. You see, despite how terrible you may be at a game, you'll always win. This is due to the fact that the computer-operated components don't have the ability to move. Take the competition away from a racing game, and you simply have a driving simulator, which back then was a laughable concept. The game also allows the player to drive through everything from hills to buildings, showing just how little effort was put into the making of the game. In other words, it's not surprising that this PC game, which was released back in 2003, mind you, sticks out as one of the worst in history. Simply put, there's no point in playing big rigs over-the-road racing, so we apologize if you were one of the unlucky saps who ended up buying it. Number 5, Bubsy 3D. And then we have Bubsy 3D, a video game that was released by Sony PlayStation in 1996. But unlike the other games on this list, the release of Bubsy 3D resulted in the death of a beloved franchise for almost 2 decades in total. For those of you who don't know, Bubsy was one of the most revered video game characters of the Sony era, with many placing him alongside the likes of Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon. And similarly to those other properties, Bubsy was very much a platforming game that appealed to children. That being said, the launch from 2D platforming to a 3D environment is something that the developer had not thought through, with the world of Bubsy looking as if it was crafted on Microsoft Paint. That wasn't the only aspect where Bubsy 3D fell short though. Critics also blasted the installment for its terrible control, wandering camera, horrendous voice acting, and overall change in the character's beloved personality. That being said, Sony PlayStation took this failure with a pinch of salt and tried its best to revive the franchise back in 2017 with the release of Bubsy: The Woolies Strike Back. And at this point, it goes without saying, but the sequel was similarly received to Bubsy 3D. In other words, Bubsy 3D single-handedly destroyed the Bubsy franchise, destroying our childhood joy in the process. Number 6, Zelda: The Wand of Gamelon. Last but not least, we have a Zelda title which was released on the Philips CDI back in 1994. And this is surprising to many considering how The Legend of Zelda has always been one of the greatest and best received franchises in the history of gaming. The same could not, however, be said for Zelda: The Wand of Gamelon, though. When this action-adventure game was developed by Animation Magic, they thought it would be a great idea to play as Princess Zelda rather than the leading man of the franchise, Link. And since Zelda is the character that Link always has to save, this made no sense whatsoever. The fact that the game featured the same side-scrolling view as we saw in Zelda 2 also added to its unplayability, with things simply not working well on the commercially unsound Philips CDI console. The gameplay itself was also far removed from the rest of the franchise, with many considering it to be rather slow and tedious. Surprisingly enough, Zelda: The World of Gamelon initially received mixed reviews though, which caused many gamers to ask whether Nintendo had ended up paying game journalists in an attempt to influence their opinion. And while this was never proven, it's really the only explanation behind the game not getting skewered by critics on release. Either way, it's beyond terrible. And there you have it, some of the most hated games of all time. Did your least favorite make the list? And if so, what is it about that specific game that rubbed you the wrong way? Be sure to let us know in the comments section down below.